much time you have left. So 20 minutes or so. Welcome on stage, Aku.
Thank you. Good afternoon from my part as well. Welcome to this event. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And because I have a background in theology, and theologians are never really included in anything, so I'm just happy that I was invited. So it's as a theologian with theological background, it's always a surprise that someone is interested in what you have to say. So the topic that I'm going to discuss now, very briefly, is the issue of moral responsibility. And moral responsibility has come up as a topic a number of times already, but I'm going to focus on a very specific aspect of it. But generally speaking, the question of the reason why we are interested in the issue of responsibility in the context of AI is pretty much that we are worried about who to blame if things go wrong. So what we want to find out, and what we want to make sure, is that we do actually have someone to blame when things don't work. And is a very crucial thing for us as human beings, to be able to see things from the point of view of blame, praise, attitudes like that. So these attitudes are a part and parcel of our social and moral life. And the reason why they come up here is that in the AI discussion, we don't always see where the responsibility goes. So who is responsible for what, and so on. Because we're dealing with various kinds of hybrid systems that are hybrid in the sense that they have designers, manufacturers, programmers, distributors, users, and people who maintain them. And this already raises a lot of questions about responsibility. And we're worried about the so-called responsibility gap that was already mentioned before as being the idea that if these systems get too complicated, then people perhaps might hide behind the systems and try to avoid their own responsibility for the kinds of things that they do. And then this approach, this worry about the responsibility gap, is something that I think we see in many of these AI strategies in the European countries, in the UK strategy, in the French strategy, the Finnish one, that we as human beings are collectively responsible for the direction of technological developments, and that there has to be a human being somewhere in the loop, and that human being is the responsible one. So if there always has to be a procedure where we can find a human being to blame if things go wrong. And this is a snippet from the French strategy. It says, it's vital to ensure that at any point in the discussion, responsibility can be attributed to a human being via a predetermined procedure. So there's always this idea that there's a human in the process, and the blame is always attributable to the human, at least in some legal sense. Okay, so what I want to do next is to ask a very basic question. Why not blame the systems themselves? So what would it take for an artificial intelligence system or a robot to be responsible in the sense of being an apt subject of blame, for instance? And this is the question that I want to ask. Is this possible at all? Or is there some sense in which it's possible? But the problem is, the immediate problem that we end up with here is that it seems that these systems are quite different from us, from human beings. And usually it is said that there are these big buts on the way here. The reason why these systems can't be responsible because they don't have consciousness or they don't have free will. So AI systems, be they robots or whatever, they lack these two basic capacities that we think that we human beings have. But they don't. And these are on the way of holding these systems responsible, that they can't be held responsible in any way. And this is very typical of the discussion as well. There are ideas of selfhood or intentionality, emotions, consciousness, free will. These are somehow requirements of moral responsibility. Otherwise, an agent is not an agent at all, or not qualified to be morally responsible if they're lacking some of these things, like selfhood and intentionality and consciousness and so on. And this you can see in the discussion in a recent paper, for instance, by these guys mentioned here. they basically say that robots or AI systems can't be responsible because they lack phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness is a specific type of consciousness, which is the idea that there's a certain feeling or a certain phenomenal quality to various actions and experiences and so on and so on. But because these systems don't have phenomenal consciousness, or at least it's questionable whether they have that, then they can't be morally responsible. Because phenomenal consciousness, as they say, is somehow implicated in a broad range of theories of moral decision making, and some sort of self-awareness, moral imagination, intuition are missing. Okay, so if we're examining the issue of responsibility, is there a way to get around this perhaps? Well, one way, if one is really keen in having these systems having some sort of moral responsibility, would be to say something like this. We should say that perhaps free will and consciousness are not needed for all kinds of moral responsibility attributions. Perhaps it's enough if these artificial systems have relevantly similar cognition than humans, are they relevantly similar in their behaviors, some sort of functional equivalency. So they can functionally play certain kinds of roles that we humans have, and those roles themselves are the grounds which make it possible for us to hold these systems responsible, at least in some way. And this might be a way to circumnavigate this problem with free will, because it's very typical, especially in the philosophical conversation on free will, just to define free will as a component of moral responsibility. So that the question of free will becomes then a question of whether moral responsibility attitudes are apt in one situation or another. And there's of course a lot of discussion about this. So whether it's enough just to have some sort of functional equivalency or functional correspondence or something like that, or do we need something like consciousness or something deeper? But I think we can proceed here on the assumption that some sort of functional equivalency is enough, at least for some kind of moral treatment, not perhaps a full-blown moral treatment, but a certain kind of moral treatment. And this, I think, is one of the problems that we have in the current discussion, is that we haven't really thought through that moral responsibility is a big panoply of all sorts of things. It's not an on-off thing. It's not like, well, those are the moral responsible things and those are not, or those are the kinds of things that can have these moral responsibility relationships, and those are the kinds of things that don't. And we have a big range of various things. And so I'm wondering whether AI in certain forms could fit in somewhere in the range, not like an adult human being range, but somewhere in there. So one way to get into this direction is to say something like this, that we move the discussion a little bit from consciousness and free will, which are very interesting, and I'm all about that, and I like the stuff, but to the question whether these systems can play certain kinds of moral roles in human moral situations. So that's one way of doing it. So this gets us a little bit around the problem of free will and consciousness. But there's also another way of looking at this. In a recent paper by a couple of Finnish philosophers, Rauli Hakli and Pekka Mäkelä, they argue that the problem here is that the issue is not really consciousness or free will, but there's a problem with moral autonomy. So they argue that artificial systems, just by virtue of being artificial, they have a specific kind of history. They're made by someone, and that someone, the designer, has designed their character and their moral attributes in a certain way. And that makes the systems already non-autonomous in this moral sense, which means that they can't really be held morally responsible. So there's a specific kind of history argument here. This is a big discussion in philosophy, and there's a lot of debate about the kinds of histories that qualify one for moral appraisals and the kinds of histories that rule that out. It's a very difficult conversation, and I can't really go into it here. But the basic idea in this paper, which is a really good paper by the way, is that, and well, they put it quite concisely here, robots are not and will not be fit to be held morally responsible because they are designed, built and programmed by other agents to have the character that they have. That the way that they are is not dependent on them. And this undermines their moral autonomy, basically putting them in the category of not being really responsible or being responsible at all. Okay, I'm myself pretty sympathetic to this view that there is a certain historical condition in moral responsibility that you have to fulfill in order to be qualified to be a morally responsible agent. But there are views on moral responsibility that don't have this kind of historical requirement. And there are many reasons for why such views exist. But I'm going to go with one of them in the context of this paper. So I'm trying to put the bar for moral responsibility as low as possible to see whether anything goes over it in the AI sphere. So I don't have a really good counter-argument to this view here. I'm just going to choose a view of moral responsibility, a theory of moral responsibility that doesn't have the historical condition, which will get around this worry. We forget that slide. Okay, so what is this view then? So if we are to answer the question, can these systems be morally responsible, we have to have an idea of what moral responsibility is. And this is the problem, we have so many views on what it is. So I just pick one, because I think that this view it has certain plausibility and also it gives us something in terms of the AI discussion. So I take this from David Shoemaker, who's a philosopher who's developed a theory of moral responsibility of a very specific kind. In the literature, usually these are called reactive attitudes theories. And the idea is that moral responsibility is a set of attitudes that we direct to one another based on how we relate to one another. So if you treat me in a certain way, that triggers a certain response in me. So if you overlook my interests, for instance, if you behave like an asshole towards me, I respond in a certain way. So it's moral responsibility, and being moral responsible is being part of this network of attitudes and emotions. And Peter Strawson, who is the father of this way of thinking, this reactive attitude way of thinking, he thought that it often comes down to pretty basic emotions, like hating someone, or being angry at someone, or being resentful. These are negative ones, but there are also positive ones, that you're admiring someone, you're praising someone, you're thanking someone. That it really comes down to these kinds of basic attitudes. And then the question is, well, under what conditions is it appropriate to direct certain kinds of attitudes, like resentment and gratitude, towards another person? And the question in our case is, when is it appropriate to resent or be grateful or blame, to think well of an artificial agent in this context? Again, this is a non-historical view, so the history of the agent, it doesn't really matter for the kinds of responses that we take towards the agent. So it doesn't matter how the agent became what it is to the assessment. It doesn't matter that much, at least. And finally, one of the benefits of this theory, I think, is that responsibility, like in many of these theories, is a matter of degree. So it's not just person being responsible or not being responsible. There's a lot of variation there. So there are full agents, marginal agents, non-agents, and people can have different attitudes towards them. And Shoemaker's book, the Shoemaker theory, is actually an attempt to develop this idea in the context of various kinds of marginal agents. So he discusses psychopaths, depressed people, addictions, things like that, people whose moral autonomy or moral agency is somehow impaired, and to see how these responsibility attitudes might work. So here's the theory, pretty short version of it, and it's a three-part theory. So there are three parts to holding someone morally responsible. So there are three types of attitudes that are associated with holding someone responsible. There's what he calls attributability, answerability, and accountability. And these are all different aspects of holding someone morally responsible. And their targets are a little bit different. So when we attribute an action to a person, then the object is the character of the person. So we're talking about the kind of character that the agent has. The kinds of emotions that are usually associated with this kind of holding of attributing moral responsibility is like admiration, esteem on the positive sense. Negative sense is disdain, disesteem, contempt, hatred, or anger. And there are some examples. I invented those, the kinds of reactions that you might somehow describe the reaction. So here we have something like, this is in the philosophical, it's called attribution. And so what's going on there is that if you do something, let's say that you promise to come and give a talk, but you don't show up, then someone thinks that, okay, well, let's say that's me. I don't show up. Then someone thinks, well, Aku doesn't really care about us. He has something else to do, so he doesn't care about us. So what happens there is that you attribute a certain kind of tendency or an intention to me. But then it turns out that my bus was late, or I got my leg shot off, or something like that, so I couldn't come. So that attribution doesn't make any sense in that case. You can't say that, well, Aku was very negligent or didn't care about us, because it didn't have anything to do with the way that I related to you. So in that sense, if it happens that I don't come because I don't care about you, then you're attributed something to me. Then the action can be attributed to me. But not coming can't be attributed to me if it was because of having a problem of some other kind that had nothing to do with you. So it's not attributed to me. And then if you take an attitude of contempt or hatred towards me because I didn't show up and it wasn't really up to me, then that is not a justifiable attitude. But if you tend to hate me or dislike me because I didn't bother showing up, then that kind of attitude is justified. So this is the idea. But attribution is not the only one. It's not the only thing going on in responsibility. So action attribution is just the basis of it. There's also other things going on. So answerability is the second step here, according to Shoemaker. So answerability is something that is directed towards the kinds of judgments that I've made, moral judgments, and yes, thank you, and attribute and the kinds of intentions, for instance, I take, and so on and so on. And then finally, there's a form of moral responsibility called accountability, which means that takes into account the kind of regard that we have for other people. This regard is a very kind of specific term, but it refers to how we appreciate and how we take into account others' intentions. So we have different kinds of emotions responding to these different aspects. This will be the last slide, so I'm close to the end. The next one will be the last one, so this is the penultimate one. Okay, so if we apply this to develop this, no, it's not the last slide. I was wrong. Sorry. Yeah. So if you look at the requirements in terms of attributability, what you need is something like character, and that requires, let's say, intentional action, some sort of basic autonomy. So the ability to act independently and coherently in the long run somehow, in pursuit of certain goals, perhaps. What is needed for answerability is something like reasonable autonomy, ability to form moral judgments, to acquire them and evaluate the norms that you have. And then finally, accountability, what you need is usually some sort of communicative aspect. So you have to be able to use your reason in a language, in a communicative situation. So the ability to take into account relevant consequences, implications, ability to give reasons. So engage in this kind of dialogue. So if we have these, what can we say about AI? So could AI somehow qualify in some of these groups? So I think that we can start from the idea that current and foreseeable AI is not really functionally equivalent because with humans, because it's clearly lacking in communication, autonomy, and especially reason, understanding moral reasons. There are some steps towards some sort of operational moral responsibility, and especially in terms of attribution. So the ability to act from some sort of reasons flexibly under different conditions. So systems can learn from their environment and they can act in order to execute a certain goal, and they can flexibly do that. Well, that seems to be moving, at least in my mind, towards some sort of attributability, because we can attribute goals, we can attribute some sort of intentions or something like that to these systems. Answerability, it seems that some sort of machine learning systems, unsupervised learning, might be developing a little bit into this direction. Some sort of acquisition of norms or goals independently, not just being programmed with certain norms or goals, but to be able to change them and develop them. That steps towards autonomy might come close to something like that. And finally, in terms of accountability, there might be also some developments that are going on that might contribute to that, something like emotional AI and so on. I don't have too much time to explain this. So this is the final slide. So what can we say? It seems to me that some sort of attributability might at least be in the horizon. So it might be that an artificial system might be such that it has certain patterns of behavior, not just randomly behaving in a certain way, but learning and then trying to achieve a certain goal. Well, that seems to me to be some sort of ground for attribution, action attribution. We could say that a system makes certain kinds of actions, and those actions are directed towards a goal, and there might be a pattern in which those actions are being taken. That seems a bit like character in the moral sphere. So it might make some sense to have some sort of attribution, action attribution going on. And then this, given the theory that I presented here, this gives the possibility and makes it possible to adopt certain kinds of attitudes, like being angry or hating a system like this. Because normally we do tend to become angry to our computers or copier machines or that, something like that. But we don't really think that it's justified, or we don't really think that it's a useful attitude to have, or it's somehow rational to be angry at your computer because it decides not to work. But here, in this case, it might actually be a rational attitude to take, to attribute a certain kind of pattern of behavior to this system, because it is behaving as if it had some sort of a character. But the problem is that answerability, that the third one, might be quite difficult, probably impossible. It might require something like a conscious AI, and the same thing with accountability. Because it seems that to be accountable for one's actions, one seems to need language as some sort of means to have a dialogue and to be able to shape one's intentions and norms in a very specific way. So that seems out of bounds as far as I'm concerned. So perhaps we should think of very complex AIs, perhaps in the future, that might be responsible in a similar way that sociopaths are responsible. So people who are unable or incapable of, let's say, orienting from their lives from certain kinds of moral emotions and moral considerations. Because for the sociopath, the kinds of reactions that people have, the moral evaluation doesn't really take into account what other people feel, for instance. And it might be that AI is something like this. And for simpler AI, perhaps something like a very small child. So you attribute certain actions to a child, but you don't really hold a very small child accountable because they can't really explain why they're doing what they're doing, or you might not expect them to be answerable for the kinds of actions that they do. So what I've said so far is that there might be some aspects of moral responsibility, especially certain forms of attributability, that might be at least conceivably given or attributed to artificial systems according to this theory. So this is a purely philosophical exercise what I'm doing here. So I'm not saying that this is what you should do. But if we accept this theory, then this at least gives us something to go on. But what I haven't said, that we should give some sort of legal responsibility or rights or anything like that, because it seems that they require a certain kind of moral agency that is not really present in these cases. So even if we give some sort of partial moral responsibility, especially of the attributionist kind, it doesn't necessarily entail anything about legal responsibility or things like that, which is, I think, partly a game of its own, which I don't really have anything to say, because these societal issues are so complicated, so it's difficult to say anything about that. But that pretty much concludes what I want to say here. Thank you.